Hi, everybody. Hi, how's it going? Um, I just kind of wanted to get into the revolution itself. And when we're looking at this class, I got my shades on. I got these things that the Indians gave me the other day. All I had to do was participate in the survey for State Farm. They gave them to me for free, so that was pretty sweet. So I'm going to wear these. But, if you look at the revolution and this class and any types of warfare, I guess we'll get into more detail with the Civil War in terms of military history, but I'm not gonna really dwell on specific battles and what happened and the battle strategies and all that stuff. I just want to give you key points and key pieces of information that will allow you to sort of understand why the Americans won the American Revolution, why they were able to get rid of the British. And this is all about the formation of the country. And I want to start with this very famous pamphlet. I don't know if we've talked about this in class yet. I'm doing this before I'm teaching the causes. But, about a third of the colonists were for revolution. About a third of them were neutral, and about a third of them were loyalists. Of course, we're going to, or maybe we've had this debate, depending on when you're watching this, on Friday, between the loyalists and the revolutionaries. And I think there were good arguments on both sides. It's a very difficult issue, and even now I look at the loyalist perspective, and I think that makes sense. They have a lot of good points. But it was the revolutionaries who won out in the end. A lot of people turned to the revolutionary side after they read the Thomas Paine pamphlet called Common Sense, where essentially the gist of the argument in that pamphlet is that it defies common sense for this tiny little island to govern all of these colonies all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Why does that make sense? How does that make sense? And that was the message behind Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and that caused a lot of people to wonder, well, that makes common sense if we were to break away. And it doesn't make common sense if Britain was to rule the colonies. So this became a very famous pamphlet, started to circulate all throughout the colonies. Finally, Second Continental Congress met in the summer of 1776. And this was sort of the linchpin moment of the American Revolution. This is where, or actually the linchpin moment in the history of the United States, perhaps. I guess it can be argued there are many, many important turning points. But the motion to declare independence was filed by a Virginian named Richard Henry Lee, and the Continental Congress voted for independence. And Thomas Jefferson, a very young Virginian, he was a planter. He had a very wealthy, huge plantation called Monticello, which you could still go visit. Slave owner. He was chosen, and very polished writer, extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily educated. He was sort of like a Renaissance man. He was a musician, a philosopher, a writer, a statesman. Eventually would become President of the United States. He was the one that drafted the Declaration of Independence. He was chosen. And then, with editing help from Ben Franklin, a final draft was produced. The Declaration of Independence was signed July 4th, 1776. This was, and I plan on reading this in class, doing an activity with the actual document. But this was a series of complaints against King George III, a list of grievances, if you will. Thomas Jefferson was very much influenced by the British philosopher John Locke, who was all about self-government, who was all about natural right, that people do have natural rights that are given to them by a higher power, according to John Locke. And based on these natural rights, one of these natural rights was the right that the oppressed have to cast off an unjust ruler, a corrupt ruler. And that's exactly the purpose of the American Revolution, was to get rid of an unjust ruler. And that unjust ruler was King George III. And then, after the Declaration was signed, all of a sudden, these colonies, officially, I mean, we celebrate our Independence Day, July 4th, 1776. These colonies become the, not colonies anymore, but the United States of America. And I would sing right now, but I don't really want, well, oh, beautiful, never mind. For spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. Never mind. They were singing, actually that song hadn't been written yet, I don't think. But, after the colonies declared independence, people celebrated. And it increased the morale of the army. I mean, it was like, okay, before we were fighting to return things to where they were. And it was really kind of abstract, really unclear what they were fighting for. Now, the army was fighting for the existence of a new nation. And it also required the Congress to come up with some sort of governing body, some sort of way to govern these United States. And that would be a process in itself, let me tell you. I mean, that's never an easy thing to do. Just look at, the Middle East after the Arab Spring, for example. Google that. Look that up. Read about it. George Washington was the man that the Congress chose to lead the colonial army. Washington, he had a very difficult time with this army. This army was these backwoods individuals, not trained soldiers whatsoever, but he set up a training camp at Valley Forge, and with the help of, a Prussian, Baron von Steuben, he was able to sort of create a disciplinary colonial army, or a disciplined colonial army, I should say. He was able to enforce some discipline. Not only that, Washington would eventually gain the respect of his men, which was extremely important because, again, these men were not trained soldiers. They were average citizens, in many ways very rough citizens, in many ways very undisciplined and unruly. Washington, his qualities, basically led him to become one of the greatest generals in history. And also, he became, these qualities would lead him to become the first president of the United States. Patience, courage, self-discipline, a sense of justice. His soldiers and also the citizens of the United States saw him as a great moral force, more so than a military mind, although he was that sort of too. I would say his attack on Trenton, the famous crossing the Delaware and orchestrating a surprise attack against the British, qualifies as a great military strategy, no question. And that's kind of what he was all about. His military tactics were non-traditional. He kind of violated the established rules of war in the 18th century world. Certainly surprising the Europeans and the British, I should say. He employed surprise attacks and also non-traditional tactics such as guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is kind of like these surprise attacks or snipers hanging out in the woods, waiting for the British to come out and then taking down officers. So this wasn't just, one army lining up against the other army and charging each other. This was hiding out, almost like terrorist attacks. And again, like I said in a previous broadcast, the Vietnamese would use this in, the Vietnam War. And that's how they defeated the Americans there. This was very unconventional, very revolutionary for the time. A couple of key battles that led the United States to victory. The Battle of Saratoga, which was in 1777, George Washington wins a very key battle against the British. And because of that, very important battle because the French decide to support the Americans. And the reason why was, the French years before, and we just studied the French and Indian War, had lost all their colonies to the British, and as a result, the French wanted to get back at their old nemesis, Great Britain. And of course, they saw this opportunity. They said, hey, we're looking at the colonists and the United States, this new country, the British, they're having trouble with them. What? Well, we'll just, and they've proven that they can hang with them through the Battle of Saratoga. Well, we will just help that process move right along. And hopefully the British will lose their colonies, just like we lost our colonies. Ha! We'll get them back. The French supplied, they supplied supplies, weapons, they supplied soldiers, they supplied leadership, generals, and with the help of the French and many other different battles throughout the next few years, the United States came on top. The final battle was the Battle of Yorktown, in which the British Army was trapped Yorktown's kind of, in between, well, it's in Virginia, and it's all kind of off the coast a little bit, or near the coast. The French and the Americans were able to basically trap the British in this town in Yorktown, 1783. At the Battle of Yorktown, at the end of it, after the British had been soundly defeated, they surrendered, in which the British fife player played this song called "The World Turned Upside Down." And to the British, the world had turned upside down because a ragtag group of colonies, I said this before, defeated and defended their turf against perhaps without a question, the most powerful nation in the world to that point. Of course, the United States would eventually, years and years later, claim that mantle for themselves. What ended the war officially was the Treaty of Paris of 1783, in which Great Britain officially recognized America, the United States, as an independent nation. And they also ceded all of this territory. As you can see here, they gave all of this territory to the United States. And all of this would eventually become the southern states: Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, of course, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. I mean, all of this stuff. So this was a huge gain for the United States. And they also exercised the right to collect outstanding debts from the states. So that was a little thing that the British had going for them in this treaty. But again, the United States gains all this land. They're able to get rid of the British, and there you have it. Amazing. I want to talk a little bit about women and the role of women in this war. The Daughters of Liberty, a very important group. And we often try to discuss, what the role of women are in society. And that's something that we've all, history and civilizations we've kind of struggled with the oppression of women throughout human history. And this is no different. The Daughters of Liberty, organized a boycott of British goods. This was an organization of women who supported the revolution. And they boycotted British goods, and they provided organizational support for the revolution. They organized things. They fixed supplies, uniforms. They made uniforms. They organized different things such as supplying the army with food and things of that sort that would really aid the revolution. And then you had this idea of Republican motherhood. And Republican motherhood is a kind of a very I would say a very dated concept. This was the idea that, to aid this new country, it's better for women to take an active role at home. In other words, they should not be on the front lines or involved with the government or involved in stately things or with the army or whatever. Their best role, or the most preferable role for them, would to educate their sons and advise their husbands so they can participate in the government, so they can participate in the army. So it was not up to them to participate, but it was up to them to get their sons and husbands ready to participate. So again, this is kind of an example of sort of women taking a back seat to men in many regards. Well, in that regard, definitely. In the regard of, participating in politics. And again, if you look at the makeup of Congress today, you see by far and away the majority of Congress is made up of men. Our elected officials, primarily men. We've never had a woman president. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, mostly are men. We're still looking for women to take an active role in leadership positions. And unfortunately, that has not happened yet. Women would not receive full equal rights or gain the right to vote. And just to kind of put this in perspective, it would not be until the 20th century, 1920, till women received the right to vote. So be familiar with Republican motherhood. That is a little bit about the revolution. That is in a nutshell, and even at that, I went way over. It's 16 minutes. I will see you all later, skaters.